It is my absolute pleasure to introduce journalist Samira Mohyeddin, our 16th annual keynote speaker, who will deliver an address entitled The Israel Exception. Samira Mohyeddin is the editor-in-chief and founder of On the Line Media, a digital journalism organization. Be sure to check out the incredible content on YouTube if you're not familiar. And after I'm done here, I'll drop some links in the chat where you can find Samira's work. A former CBC radio host and producer, she's known for her bold reporting, her critiques of traditional media, and her perspective as a queer journalist from Iran. Samira is behind the CBC podcast Gay Girl Gone, which you might be familiar with. She has a background in theater studies, an undergraduate degree in religion, and a master's degree in gender and modern Middle Eastern history from U of T. Samira is also a founding member of, I hope I have this right, Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine, a national coalition which formed in April 2025 in response to growing concerns among Canadian journalists about the accuracy, balance, and depth of media coverage concerning Palestine. And the importance of this organization, I think, cannot be overstated given the levels of anti-Palestinian racism that we are seeing in Canadian media, as well as various kinds of attacks on freedom of expression to speak and report on Palestine. Most importantly, I know we are all thinking of the brave, dedicated Palestinian journalists targeted and murdered by Israel with no accountability at alarming and unprecedented rates. Samira, I am so grateful for your journalism, for the way you cut through the BS and hold Zionists to account. It's truly an honor to have you join us, and we're all looking forward to hearing you speak now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be among you, and thank you so much for the invitation. Um, Before anything, I want to acknowledge that we're gathering on stolen Indigenous land. This is a truth that Canadian journalism had for too long underreported, just as it now fails to report honestly on the colonial violence and genocide unfolding in Gaza and other parts of occupied Palestine. I also want to begin by acknowledging the many journalists, storytellers, and truth seekers in this room tonight and others who are joining us, and those around the country who are working with courage and integrity in these very difficult times. I want to recognize that speaking openly about malfeasance in journalism carries great risk. It means naming discomforts, calling out structural pressures, and often being cast as the troublemaker. But truth itself demands that we speak. Today, I want to talk about how journalism in Canada is faltering, not in its intent specifically, but in its practice. I want to explore how malfeasance is not always visible, how it often shows up as silences, omissions, softening of language, fear of backlash, and how those threats come from inside the newsroom as much as they do from outside. We are living in an unprecedented moment in media, and not in a good way. Since October 7th, 2023, we have witnessed the deliberate erasure of context, the dehumanization of Palestinian lives, and the wholesale collapse of journalistic standards in the Canadian corporate media landscape. What is happening in Gaza is not a conflict, it is not a war, it is a genocide. And journalism in this country has not only failed to name it, but has become complicit in covering it up. Today, I want to talk to you about what that failure looks like, what it costs us, and why the refusal of Canadian newsrooms to acknowledge this crisis amounts to journalistic malfeasance. We've heard of the Palestine exception, but today I want to focus on the Israel exception. Of course, the two are inextricably linked. However, I want to focus on what happens to journalism when Israel is the culprit, when Israel is the liar, when Israel is killing journalists. Now, when I say malfeasance, I do not mean only deliberate deception. I mean the less visible abuses, selective framing, lack of context, suppression of certain voices, and unbalanced both sides tropes, and the chilling of speech out of fear, fear of complaints, fear of being labeled, and fear of losing funding or employment. Canadian newsrooms have played an undeniable role in shaping public ignorance around the Israeli state and its indefatigable occupation of the Palestinian people and their land. Instead of contextual reporting, we get euphemism. Instead of historical background, we get flattened timelines. Instead of telling readers or listeners who is bombing whom, we get passive voice. A building was struck, children died, a hospital was hit. Who did it? Why? Under whose orders? In violation of which laws? These are basic questions of journalism, Journalism 101. And yet they vanish when the perpetrator is Israel. Why? Because Canadian media, for all its claims to fairness, has allowed itself to become an echo chamber for state narratives, both Israeli and Canadian. They amplify press releases from the IDF without any independent verification. They cite security concerns when Palestinian journalists report from the ground, often right before they're killed. And they almost never tell the Canadian public that what's happening in Gaza violates international law. This is not accidental, it's not a glitch, this is structural and systemic. Here are some concrete ways that I've witnessed or experienced this in Canada. And please note that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples. These are just two that I've drawn out. On January 20th, 2025, on CBC News Network, this is Canada's 24-hour news channel, a CBC host was interviewing a Palestinian Canadian guest who was speaking about trying to get her family out of Gaza and how her brother was killed in just the first weeks of this genocide. And while she was talking to the host, she used the word genocide. She spoke for about 4 minutes about the loss of her brother and the emptiness and helplessness that she was feeling. The CBC host, after listening to this grueling testimonial, responded with, "We at CBC can't use that term. I hope you understand." And then she mistakenly says that the case is before the International Criminal Court, which it wasn't. It's before the International Court of Justice. And it just leaves you feeling as to why the CBC host felt the need to say that. Not only that, during the entire segment, you don't even hear the host say the word Israel once. You don't know who killed the brother. You don't know why Gaza or who's doing the destroying. So as a viewer, what are your thoughts when you see this authoritative host tell millions of Canadians that it's not a genocide and don't call it that?
بنك فلسطين في شارع عمر مختار. بنك فلسطين تم تدميره بالكامل. هاي بنك فلسطين تم تدميره بالكامل.
The other example is a much more recent one, and it's a peculiar one, and I use that term purposefully, but I'll explain why. Again, this is an example from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation on their morning radio show in Toronto, which aired on September 3rd, 2025. The host was interviewing Holocaust Studies and History professor Omer Bartov, who teaches at Brown University. He had written an op-ed in the New York Times about how he studied genocide all his life and that what he's now seeing unfolding in Gaza is a genocide. And so the interview begins with the host asking, how did you come to this conclusion? What was it that made you now change your mind and say, yes, this is a genocide? And so Professor Bartov goes through all the reports that he's read from different organizations and his own research, and he talks about the systemic destruction of civilian infrastructure. He talks about the bombing of every single school, university, the decimation of the healthcare system, the bombing of hospitals, laying out how Israel meets all the criteria in the Genocide Convention, and how it meets those criteria, particularly with the cutting of aid. No food, no water, no fuel, all of that. And then, and here's why I say peculiar. All of a sudden, the host interrupts Bartov and says how precision is very important. And then he asks Bartov, and here I'm quoting, quote, "Who is perpetuating a genocide in your mind? What group in particular?" End quote. And there is this odd 3-second silence, and Bartov responds quite in a bewildered manner and says, "The state of Israel." And the host responds with, quote, "The state, not Israelis, but the state through its military forces." So this is the part I wanted to actually play this for you so you can hear for yourselves how absurd it is. And I hope you can hear this. I'm pretty sure you can. So
basically not only to make life impossible, but to make it impossible for that group to reconstitute itself if ever it were allowed to come back and rebuild its life there.
Precision matters so much here. And so I want to ask you, who is perpetrating a genocide in your mind? What group particularly?
The state of Israel.
The state, not Israelis, but the state through its military forces.
Basically, not only to make.
So you can hear there, Bartov was kind of like, he couldn't even believe he was being asked such an inane question about who is doing the genocide, who's perpetuating the genocide. But then the host doesn't stop there. He keeps pressing on because he didn't quite get from Bartov what he wanted. So he goes back and he does this. Have a listen to this.
I mean, I ask you for precision because we are here in North America. There are many instances of anti-Semitism directed at Jewish people. You are a Jewish man. You are an Israeli citizen. And you believe there is genocide being perpetrated by the state of Israel against the Palestinians. How are you seen within the Jewish community because you've taken that position?
Well, I mean, I can't tell you exactly how I'm seen by the Jewish community. It's a large community. Different people have different opinions, obviously.
I mean, you can almost hear Omar Bartov cringing in that interview. How do you explain that interview? And this was quite a long interview for that morning show. What do you, as a listener, learn about Gaza or about Omar Bartov's findings from that interview? Not much. And how did we get onto the subject of anti-Semitism? We learn nothing about the genocide or Gaza in that interview. Instead, Omar Bartov is painted as being a controversial figure, perhaps not liked in his own community, and you have a host playing identity issues with his guest instead of dealing with the subject at hand, which was Israel committing a genocide. Now, I interviewed Omar Bartov last year. He is a preeminent scholar of Holocaust and genocide studies in the world. But instead, here he is reduced to a man whose family may not be inviting him over for dinner every Sunday or Friday or whatever. These are just examples from the Canadian landscape, but there are hundreds that I could point to with a very clear pattern. And I don't want to spend all night on these examples because we could be here for a couple of weeks. But I wanted to give you an example from what is known as the paper of record. This is from the New York Times on June 1st, 2024, and it's around language and the language that we used. This is a subheadline on a story about settler violence and the murder of several Palestinians by Zionist settlers. And I'm going to read a sentence to you. Listen carefully. Since the war in Gaza began, armed settlers, often accompanied by the army, have stepped up seizures of land long used by Palestinians. I'll read that last part again. Listen, land long used by Palestinians. What is land long used by Palestinians? I believe that is Palestine. That was the sub-headline from the New York Times. All of those words, just not to say the word Palestine. The headline was no better. Here's the headline. In the West Bank, guns and a locked gate signal a town's new residents. What does that headline tell you? That could be a story about anything, anywhere. And just pay attention to the fact that the West Bank is no longer occupied. We are in a crisis of journalism, not because journalists are failing to file stories, but because the craft itself is being hollowed out by fear, complicity, and institutional cowardice. I want to be very clear tonight. When over 65,000 Palestinians, and we know that that number is not the real number, many of them children, are being killed, when hospitals are systemically bombed, and when entire families are being erased from civil registries, and Canadian outlets refuse to use the word genocide, we are not dealing with objectivity. We are dealing with ideological alignment disguised as neutrality. The refusal to name what is plainly before our eyes is not a failure of vocabulary. It is a failure of moral and professional courage. So what are the barriers? And I think it's important to name precisely the kinds of pressures here that are structural and that lead to this sort of malfeasance. Among them, external advocacy pressure. These are groups like Honest Reporting Canada, who send alerts, submit complaints, and call out bias or campaign for corrections. And the frequency of these campaigns increases with the coverage of Palestine. The Canada Press Freedom Project has done an excellent job of mapping this out, and I really suggest checking out the work they've done. There's also the institutional fear or backlash. Editors, newsroom leaders, and even funders worry about public relations, loss of ads or donors, accusations of bigotry or bias. This risk aversion often leads to overcorrection or just plain avoidance of the topic. There's also ambiguity in policy. Many newsrooms have rules around impartiality, balance, and defamation, but these policies are vague enough that they can be used as justification to avoid taking strong, necessary stances. And of course, there's the harassment of individual reporters. As is now well documented, reporting critically invites harassment, online threats, intimidation, vandalism. These acts target not just individuals, but aim to create fear among all those who might report similarly. And I can tell you about one specific instance a bit later if there's time. There's also the real fear of career insecurity. Many journalists are already in precarious positions, freelancers, short-term contracts, and are hoping to be hired full-time. The risk of being seen as controversial can feel like a risk too large to bear. That often encourages self-restraint. So why does this matter, and what is the cost of this complicity? Journalism shapes public imagination, policy debates, and how societies see themselves and others. Providing Israel with an exception to how we report, it would argue, has cost journalism. I would argue, has cost journalism greatly. We are watching the slow death of credibility. Readers and viewers are walking away in droves, not because they don't trust the media, but because they see the lie in real time. TikTok, Instagram, live streams from bombed out refugee camps, they know what's happening and they see what isn't being reported. For the public, misinformed citizens cannot participate meaningfully in a democracy. If Canadians are told Gaza is a complicated conflict rather than the systematic ethnic cleansing it is, then they cannot advocate, vote, or organize based on the truth. For Palestinian lives, every time the media obscures who dropped the bomb, every time it refuses to say genocide, it sends a message to those in power. You can get away with it. Keep on going. And it tells the victims your lives don't matter enough to be named. This is not just editorial malpractice. This is a moral abandonment. If journalism is to fulfill its role as a defender of truth, as a check on power, as a voice for the marginalized, then change is imperative. And here are some paths forward that I suggest. And by no means am I reinventing the wheel here. Other people have stressed all of these things before. Strong editorial policies grounded in principle. Newsrooms must clearly delineate between facts, analysis, and opinion. They should commit to naming actors when there is credible evidence of wrongdoing. They must refuse to hide behind quote unquote neutral voice when neutrality is actually the problem. Support for journalists under threat, legal, psychological, and professional support for those who are targeted, protection from harassment, robust protocols to manage complaints fairly and without silencing voices, transparency about editorial decisions. When stories are softened, terms changed, or coverage avoided due to fear of backlash, editors should be transparent about why. Independent ombuds or review processes should not only examine whether errors were made, but whether structural pressures influenced that coverage. Training and education. Journalists should be trained to identify bias, to resist undue pressure, and to understand power relations in storytelling, especially when covering colonialism, occupation, conflict, and genocide. Understanding history, law, and dispossession are all part of that context. If the media were doing its job, I firmly believe this, if we were living in a world in which journalism took its ethical responsibilities as seriously as its commercial ones, this genocide would have stopped long ago. But we're not. In fact, the Israel exception is why many young journalists have either left the field altogether or have been silenced and pushed out of the profession. And yet, despite this catastrophic failure, newsrooms are refusing to acknowledge that there is even a problem. We are not dealing with oversight, we are dealing with denial. Inside Canadian media institutions, journalists who try to raise concerns about skewed Gaza coverage are shut down, reassigned, or quietly pushed out. Editors insist on balanced reporting, even when that means giving equal weight to the occupier and the occupied. Freelancers are simply dropped without explanation. Palestinian voices are treated with suspicion, while Israeli military spokespeople are interviewed without challenge. Many journalists know something is wrong, but in a climate of fear, fear of being smeared, fear of losing your job, and fear of reputational damage, they stay silent. This silence is not just personal, it is institutionalized, as I've said. But there has been pushback, and a lot of it. In 2021, when Israel was bombing Gaza, a group of more than 2,000 Canadian journalists and media workers signed an open letter calling for more accurate and inclusive coverage. In response, many of those journalists who signed were reportedly sidelined or removed from covering Palestine, Israel altogether, on the basis that their signing compromised the quote-unquote perception of impartiality. I was one of those journalists. Let's stop pretending this is about objectivity. Journalism is never neutral. It always takes a side, even when it claims not to. And right now, Canadian corporate media has chosen the side of Israel. It has chosen the side of the genocidaire. It has chosen to platform military spokespeople over war crimes investigators. It has chosen to fact-check grieving mothers instead of generals. It has chosen to believe power instead of scrutinizing it. I do not speak only to journalists or to media organizations. I speak to the public, to the listener, to the reader, the watcher. We have power. We have choice. The way we consume media shapes which voices are heard, which stories are told, which injustices are acted upon. We should demand better of our journalists and of our journalism. I urge you tonight to support journalism that uncovers truth. Share it, raise it, fund it, protest when outlets distort it. Refuse to let silence be an ally to injustice, because injustice thrives not in the open, but in half-lit spaces, in omissions, in half-truths, in reticence. I believe deeply in the possibility of journalism that does not shy away, not journalism that flatters power, nor journalism that hides truth because of fear. In November of last year, I had the pleasure of interviewing UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese in person while she was here in Toronto. And she said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, quote, "Impartiality has become a pompous word for indifference and an elegant name for ignorance." What does it mean to be impartial during a genocide? When we put IDF spokespersons on the air in front of millions of Canadians for them to lie and say that they don't target journalists or that the UN is anti-Semitic, how does that benefit the public? We provide the lie as the other side of the story. How does it benefit the public to hear the lie? If we cannot name genocide while it is happening, we must ask ourselves, what is the point of this profession? Genocides are to be prevented, not lamented. Genocide is not a theory, it is not a metaphor, not when hospitals lie in rubble, when children die for lack of medicine, and when aid convoys are bombed and blocked. If the media had done its job, spoken truth without fear, exposed power without flinching, centered the suffering without shame, many of the preventable horrors might still be preventable. But even now, I don't think we have run out of time. Truth has power, words have consequence, recognition matters, accountability matters. Let us demand media that is faithful to its own calling. Media professionals, you are the first draft of history. The stories you write now will shape law, policy, memory. For many who cannot speak for themselves, your words are their voices. To you, I offer this challenge. Be brave, be precise, be truthful, because the cost is high, not only for those suffering, but for the integrity of our profession. Thank you.